Thanks for joining us. This is Ears to Hear, a podcast brought to you by the 25th Street Church of Christ in Columbus, Indiana. Check us out online at 25thstreetchurchofchrist.com for directions and meeting times. We appreciate you tuning in. Now, let's get into God's Word with Ears to Hear. Thanks for tuning in to Ears to Hear. We appreciate you joining us for this week's podcast. As usual, my name is John Hines. I'm the preacher for the Church of Christ here in Columbus, Indiana. Joining me, also as usual,
is Andrew Walker.
Andrew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
We're doing pretty well. This week we have 2 extra guests. Oh, it's a first for the program, Andrew.
There we go.
We have joining us Brace and Ashley Rutledge. Hey, y'all.
Hello.
Hey.
Good to have y'all with us. What we're going to be talking about this week, we're going to be talking about dating. And speaking as someone who has a 16-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl, it terrifies me to my very core. I know, Brace and Ashley, y'all have, how old are all the kids?
We got a son who's 21. Our oldest daughter is 19, or will be 19. Our middle son, or youngest son, I guess he is going to be 18. And then we've got a couple that are two daughters that are 10 and 5.
You all are in our prayers.
6.
Man, that's a lot of kids. That's, whew. I only have 2, and I'm scared. I'm scared. But it's, as we think about it, I know, Andrew, over here, you're the young single one.
Not single, John. 24 and dating.
24 and dating. Fair enough. But anyway, we thought that we would talk about dating this week. And I thought we might just start with thinking about how important dating is. And I'll tell you right now, if you look up dating in a concordance, funny enough, you are not going to find that word. It's simply not in the Bible. It's not, I don't even know historically when, I mean, you go back 200 years and you have courting, but even that is, in the grand scheme of things, fairly modern.
I guess the closest thing to it, you had mention of betrothals.
Yeah.
But marriages were often planned by
Yeah.
people other than those involved.
Yeah. And that's just how it was. So dating is very much a modern construct. So it's interesting to think about. And we need to think about it just because, well, good grief, as a parent, I'm thinking about it with my own kids. But to just think about scripturally and to think about dating as a precursor somehow of marriage, it makes you start thinking about, okay, well, how important is marriage? And you look back biblically, and you look back in Noah's time with the flood, and the sons of God were going into the daughters of men. And it looks like what that's talking about is you had marriages that were happening between the godly and the ungodly, and it didn't turn out well. And you see that recurring theme throughout Scripture. You just go through it and you look at the account of Balaam, and as the people of Israel were, it turns out, he used this idea as they committed harlotry with the people of Moab. And it didn't turn out well. Solomon, his heart's, there he is, 700 wives, 300 concubines. And as wise as he was, his heart was still turned away from the Lord.
Right.
Some others, who else is on our list in the Old Testament? I mean, just go through, David, being David and the Bathsheba, and you have that whole account.
Samson, we mentioned.
Yeah, Samson and Delilah.
Choosing a wife because she was pleasing to him and she looked good.
Yeah. Yep. So you just go through the whole Old Testament, and it's at some point, actually, Israel is going to have to put away their foreign wives, because it was one of the commandments, that they were commanded to not take these foreign women. And it wasn't because they were foreigners, it was because of the false religion. Because you have certain foreign women like Ruth. Well, Ruth, she was from Moab. She's in the lineage of Jesus. She comes and she's the one who says to Naomi, your God is my God. and she's there in the lineage. But you come up to the New Testament and you read verses, you read the verse about, what fellowship does a believer have with an unbeliever? And folks better, especially young folks, better recognize when they get married that it's for life, right? Until death do you part. And marriage can make you or break you. And I'll tell you, we might come back to this verse later on, but in Proverbs, when it's talking about the crafty harlot, and it makes this statement in Proverbs chapter 7, after describing her actions, her activities, and how this fella goes into her, and the comment is made, for she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. And for anybody out there who thinks, well, it can't happen to me, you're wrong. You're dead wrong. It happened to David, the man after God's own heart. It happened to Solomon. It happened to all who were slain by her were strong men. Don't think it can't happen to you. So, thought we might start there. That this is extremely important. And as a precursor to marriage, people better understand what's going on. What sort of things should we add to that, Andrew? Do you have anything on your
Well, I think it just plays into the whole mindset around dating now is really not about trying to find someone who is seeking the same things that you are from a spiritual perspective. It's about trying to find someone who in the short term makes you happy, or someone who in the short term is fun to be around, or who you enjoy being around. And it's very much about finding the things that please you as an individual, and trying to find a lot of people search for compatibility rather than a long-term partner. They're really just looking to fill a short-term need.
Yeah, and it's usually very little focus on spirituality. That it's more about, well, like you use that word compatibility. And it's, well, do they share the same interests? And usually those interests aren't, how interested are they in Bible study? Usually those interests are, what movies do you like? What foods do you like? What sports do you like? Whatever. And that's what they're looking for, with very little consideration of spirituality. What other things should we consider before we move on, or should I continue my rant?
Well, I think one of the other things that a lot of people in our culture and our time pursue is physical beauty. And you mentioned the Proverbs, and Proverbs not only talks about the kind of beauty that's attracting you for the wrong reasons, it also talks about in Proverbs 31 the passing nature of physical beauty, and that it's for a season. And if we're only seeking a wife or a husband because they're pretty or because they're easy on the eyes and fun to look at, then what happens when that beauty fades as they grow older, or changes from what it is now that has made us so attracted to them?
Yeah, and it is not wrong. The concept of beauty is not wrong. When I believe it was, it talks about Isaac's wife, that she was beautiful of appearance. I believe Jacob's wife, one of them, I should say, talks about beautiful of appearance. But at the same time, there is something that is described as the attire of a harlot. So it's one thing. Beauty is not wrong. Now, if you're trying to use the attire of a harlot, and I know I sound like an 80-year-old man ranting about this, but there is such a thing as that. And you are trying to attract someone using lasciviousness and lewdness. Now, to think about that concept, okay, who are you going to attract with that? You're going to attract someone who's attracted to lasciviousness and lewdness. That's what you're going to attract. So it's, it takes both parties are involved. But to look at that idea of people being attracted to that, and it starts going to a whole mindset. Okay, if you have a carnal mindset, and that's the path you're going to go down, you use the phrase easy on the eyes. Oh, this is a PG the PG rated podcast. It's not surprising when you have a mindset of the works of the flesh. You know, when you read about the works of the flesh up in Galatians and it's lasciviousness, lewdness, it's not a surprise that also in that list is fornication and adultery. It goes down the same path. And if that's how you're thinking about things, it's not a surprise that that's where that path leads to that door. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I think another thing too, we mentioned what Samson said when he was seeking after Delilah. She looks good to me. And a lot of what that ties back to is that interest. If that's someone's sole interest in choosing a partner or looking for someone, they're interested in pleasing themselves. Right. They're not interested in pleasing or doing what's best for the other person. They're looking for, what can this person give me? What can this person supply for me? And so that's the mindset that is going to constantly be looking for something else to please oneself, because we're never satisfied in satisfying our own selfishness. So it all goes back to, are we focused on looking for someone who we can work with and have shared goals with, or are we looking for someone to please ourselves?
And I would agree with that. And I think Andrew's points, really what I was aiming at was, is your primary motivation someone's physical beauty? And to go back to what John said, to take that a step further, I not only believe there's nothing wrong with physical beauty, I think there's a sense in which, as a husband or a wife, we ought to be attracted to our spouse, physically attracted to our spouse. But frequently that happens, whether they're considered attractive to the world or not, because we're seeking after the right kinds of things, which has to do with their spirit and their personality and who they are.
Right.
And we become attracted to that, which by extension causes us or helps us to be attracted to them physically as well.
And it's possible to do that from a standpoint of not doing it for ourselves, but doing it for the other person. People have a need to feel wanted and to feel like they are desirable to someone else. And so if we know that that's something we can do for the other person, it's in the interest of them. It's not just in the interest of ourselves.
Go ahead, Ashley.
I think it's also important for somebody that's considering dating a non-Christian or courting a non-Christian to talk to somebody in the church who has an unbelieving spouse and get their take on it, because they will, without a doubt, tell you some of the problems and issues that you're not seeing, in the church building that happen at home.
Yeah. Talk to someone who's been married to an unbeliever for 50 years. And as they, frankly, get closer to the end of their life and the hope that they have, or lack thereof, as we think about marriage and our kids, and it's like, we want to see the people we love in heaven. That's what we want to see. And if you're married to an unbeliever, needless to say, that's in serious doubt. And just living with that constantly over your head. And you have these two individuals who are going two different ways. They're in the same house, and they're going two ways. One's going the way of the world, and one's going towards heaven. And the conflict that creates within their relationship, and then the conflict that creates in their children, and then it's not an easy thing to do. That idea of selfishness, and I personally think, sexual immorality, fornication, adultery, things like that, I think it's still a manifestation of selfishness, that you are looking for what satisfies you. It's not as much about them. It's you want to satisfy your needs. And I think at the same time, in thinking about this, there's a growing idea of putting off marriage, putting off that relationship, putting things off. And I'm going to take care of me. And that's also selfishness. And whatever you want to call that, this idea of, in times past, good grief, in times past, literally, people would get married in their teens, in their mid to early teens, and that's for a whole nother discussion. But now we've gotten to the point where people are getting married, it's not uncommon, post-30. And it's an odd thing, but I think a part of that discussion is selfishness, where people are self-absorbed, and they want to do what they want to do, and they don't want to make time for someone else. and it's still selfishness. And I was just thinking about marriage and dating, and it's like you better get this concept started in dating, that this is not about you. I mean, this is sort of like, when they come to Jesus, what's the great commandment? You shall love the Lord thy God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, yeah, but what about me? Yeah, if the other person's doing what they're supposed to be doing, you'll be taken care of. It's like you supply each other's needs. The best thing I can do for my marriage is to love my wife like I need to. And if I do that, usually how it works is she reciprocates. And I understand sometimes that doesn't always happen in certain marriages, but that's how it's supposed to work. Mm-hmm. But to just think about some of the concepts within marriage that are foundational and integral to being a Christian. And Andrew, you're left out of this conversation. No, you're not. You're not left out of this conversation. Get ready for it, buddy. Here it comes. Sacrifice. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. It's like, if you want to see where the proof is in the pudding and where you have application, it's like, it's in the marriage. Mm-hmm. I understand it's in the church, but it's...
Sure.
I see my brethren a few hours a week. I see my wife a whole lot more. And, I always like to make the point, a person can be a hypocrite for a few hours a week. That's not that hard.
It's not.
But it's kind of hard to be a hypocrite at home. And you have sacrifice that is an integral part of a good and godly marriage. The idea of working together and everything that includes. My dad always, this is my dad's idea of marriage counseling. It's hilarious. He makes couples, before they get married, he makes them wallpaper a room. Because wallpapering, I don't even know, I think wallpapering has improved a little bit, but it used to be so difficult to do that he figured if you could get through a whole room without killing each other, you'd probably be all right. But you have to learn how to work together. You have to communicate. You have to talk about issues. You have to be able to tell someone else that something's wrong without doing it in such a way that is condescending and, everything that goes with it. So just working together and teaching, one another. I mean, it's a teaching thing. It's a lesson. And then you have submission. And that's integral to being a Christian, and it's integral in marriage. I mean, this is, for husbands who think, well, I'm the man, I'm the head of the family, and people are going to do what I say. No, that's effectively lording it over the flock. And you better realize when it talks about they shall become one flesh. And even in 1 Corinthians 7, and I understand it's talking about matters involving, the sexual relationship. And it's each one has authority over the other one's body. And it puts that very bluntly. And it's like, you're together. Don't think, but still, yes, there is the idea of submission. And that's where if you fall short in that, and again, this goes to the dating, it's like, you better understand this is what a good and godly marriage takes. These integral ideas that are paramount in being a Christian are also paramount in the marriage relationship. Mm-hmm. Someone else talk. I'm tired of talking.
Something that I think there's a reason in the qualifications for elders that they ought to be the husband of one wife. There are things to be learned from the marriage relationship that you can't learn alone. And I think that's part of the reason why God said it's not good for people to be alone, because he wants them to develop the learning of a loving relationship that is supposed to mirror the love that God shows for his children and for his people. So, I think we can be servants of God and not be married. Paul was an example of one who wasn't married. But I think there is a lot that we can learn and hope to learn if we make the effort and really decide that we're going to try to mirror that in the relationships that we choose.
And honestly, Paul's celibacy, and for one thing, he says he full well had the right to marry, but he knew full well he's traveling all over the place, and he's going to be in prison, and he's going to be, when Jesus told Ananias, I'm going to show him how many things he's going to suffer for my name's sake. We know Peter was married. It's just hard to imagine what would Paul have been able to do what Paul did if he would have had family in tow.
I mean, Paul says that the interests of one who's married are divided. They're constantly thinking about they're thinking about how they need to serve God, but they also need to be thinking about their spouse. So, and to go back to what we talked about earlier about people who kind of selfishly put off relationships, or they selfishly kind of choose that, I don't want to get entangled in that. Paul wasn't doing it for his own career promotion. He wasn't doing it to get ahead in life. Right. If anything, Paul's life was all the more difficult because of the things that he chose to do. So it wasn't a selfish decision of Paul that I'm gonna work on me and not get married. Paul
it was self-denial.
Right. Absolutely. Paul was 100%. I'm going to work on feeding the fledgling church. I'm going to devote everything to that. So it wasn't a decision made out of selfishness.
Yeah, very much so. Well, one of the other verses, and I think it's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where it talks about, and I think that's the passage that talks about, and it's in view of the upcoming persecution. And Paul's talking about self-control, and he says it might be better not to be married given the current circumstances. It might be better not to marry, I should say. Now, if you're already married, that's one thing. He doesn't say put away your spouse. No. But he uses that phrase, if you cannot exercise self-control, it's better to marry than to burn with passion. And Brace, you're the oldest one here. Explain that.
Well, I mean, God is the one who created the marriage relationship and all that's involved within it, including the sexual relationship. So God is the one who created us with these feelings that we have in that relationship or in relationships. And they're the feelings that lead a lot of people into sexual immorality and sin, but they're the same feelings and desires that are permitted by God and even instructed by God to be fulfilled in the marriage relationship.
It's like what the devil has always done is twisted what God has made.
Twists the good things God has created and turns them into something that's sinful and dirty and ugly. And so the marriage relationship is the place God has instituted and has instructed us that we can fulfill those desires. Those desires are good and natural and godly and pure if they are used and fulfilled within the marriage relationship. And Paul's encouraging us, if we have those desires for another person, or as a man, a woman, or as a woman, a man, then ultimately it's better to get married than it is to allow those feelings to lead you into sin and to cause you to lust.
Yeah, and I mean, even there in the midst of what the Corinthians and the other Christians were going to be facing in that first century, it's like this was a difficult time. And we may face a time like that at some point in our lives. I don't know. There's still a principle there of if it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Just that idea of, when God said, I will make him a helper comparable, a helpmeet, whichever translation you're reading out of. I think there's more to that than anatomy, for one thing. It's like, this is how he's made us. Right. He has made us for each other and to help one another, and not to sound like Jerry Maguire, I know I'm dating myself, but to complete one another.
Right.
I mean, that's what he made us for. Now, again, celibacy is an option, Paul, Barnabas, but that's an and even he says, even Paul says, and even Jesus says in that conversation, he says, not everybody can accept this, and talking about a eunuch for the kingdom's sake. Right. He says, not everybody can accept that. That's extremely difficult to do. So just the whole idea of burning with passion, and it's like, this is how the Lord frankly, the human race depends upon it.
Right.
And that idea. I wanted y'all to talk about, seeing as how you have kids who are dating, I wanted you to talk about your philosophy and some of the things. I know I've heard you talk about it before, and just talk about some of those ideas about what you think are good ideas or bad ideas, or y'all don't go mum on me.
Well, the first thing Ashley and I both want to make really clear is that our position is held on the basis of what we consider to be the best in our judgment. And it's not that we consider a different viewpoint, even one that would allow what typically happens in dating, where a young man and a young woman go out to a movie or go out to dinner or whatever. We're not suggesting that we believe that idea is sinful. It's just,
I want you to come down from Mount Sinai and
I know,
chisel it in
I know.
stone for
And-
all generations.
and if God would make that statement clear in Scripture, I would be happy to do that, but He doesn't. And so, we're, as you really pointed out at the beginning, because dating's a modern concept, I do believe God's Word gives us principles by which we can address the modern concept, but He's not going to give us a thou shalt date or thou shalt not date, as He does in some of the other things. And so we have to basically take the principles and do the best that we can in trying to uphold those. And as a parent, in trying to instill those same kinds of godly principles in our kids. And so we subscribe to the idea that modern dating, in our judgment, is dangerous. That it opens young people up, or even older people. Ashley and I got married later in life. My first wife passed away, and we got married later in life. And when we were dating, we chose to follow the same principles that I'm going to tell you about now, which is not to be involved in modern dating, but to only date in group settings, whether that was with all of our kids or whether that was with her parents or other adults. We chose to do that in a group setting.
Pause
Go
for
ahead.
a second, Bryce.
Go ahead.
What I'm going to do is, you go through this, we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 7.
Okay.
And I'm going to bring verses out that address some of these same things. Okay, so you just mentioned the first one, so group settings.
Yes.
And there in Proverbs 7, when it's describing the crafty harlot, one of the things that is said, she tells the young man, "For my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey." And we're all alone now, and nobody will know. And that concept right there is, I was a young man.
Yes.
I still am a young man. But I was that concept of nobody will ever know. Yeah, they will. The Lord knows.
And the two young people know.
The two young people
there's
know.
guilt, especially if they're two godly young people. There is the guilt that goes along with knowing that you've sinned against God and one another in committing some form of sexual immorality. So,
And again, those individuals we talked about before, King David,
yes,
Solomon, if you think it can't happen to you, you're wrong.
Right.
So I think what you're talking about is, these safeguards being put in place actually beforehand. Sometimes it's kind of hard to put safeguards in place after the fact.
absolutely.
So you have a game plan going in.
Right.
Carry on. So
Well, and I mean, that really is the idea. And again, we're not suggesting that there aren't young people and older people who have the ability to control themselves when they're alone with each other. That's not the point. I think there are a lot of young people and a lot of older people who can do that, but being alone opens you up for the opportunity of being tempted to do things you would never likely do in the company of others. And so it's just an opportunity for temptation that we felt strongly about in our own relationship. We didn't want to take the chance with, and we don't want our teenage children to take the chance with. A couple of our children are now, well, actually the third one's getting ready to turn 18. and college and all the things that go along with that, and they'll get to make their own choice as to how they want to do the dating thing. But as long as they've been in our house, we've had them apply the principles that we've used. And we've had one who has dated while living at home, and he has graciously agreed to submit to those principles, at least as best we know. We can't walk around with him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but we believe he's trying to at least uphold what we've taught him.
Okay. Rule number 1, thou shalt not be alone.
And we weren't.
Notice that was King James Version.
That's right. Well, and I think another point, and I don't know that this would be necessarily rule number 2, but I think our society has played fast and loose with the idea of sexual immorality, even among Christians, my opinion. Sexual immorality, I think, is actually a fairly good way of translating the word porneia from the Greek into modern English, because fornication, at least the way most of us understand it, is much too narrow a view. And I've known of Christians who've taken the view that fornication does not eliminate oral sex as being okay. And I mean, that it's playing really fast and loose with the idea of sexual immorality. I would suggest that Christians ought to consider a little bit more the fact that kissing is nothing. Because those of us who are married know that kissing can arouse great feelings of a sexual nature within us with our spouse. And so we ought to recognize that could happen between two young people who are kissing passionately. And so I think it's also important along this same lines to recognize that Jesus didn't mark the sin as beginning with an act. In Matthew chapter 5, as he really talks about the Jewish misunderstanding of the nature of what the law of Moses said. At least that's what I believe he's dealing with there. I don't think he's taking issue with what Moses revealed, because ultimately Jesus is the one responsible for that. He is instead taking issue with the interpretation that the Jewish leadership of the first century had put on it. So in Matthew 5, verse 27, he begins by saying, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" And I would suggest that he probably put the emphasis on the commit. You have heard that it was said that you shall not commit adultery. So in the Jewish mindset of the first century, as long as you didn't commit adultery, everything was okay. But Jesus in verse 28 says, "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And so you want to take care of sexual immorality in action. The way to do that is to stem the tide of the desires that are the root cause of those actions that ultimately it leads to. And so Jesus puts the sin as beginning, and even calls it adultery in this place, as beginning with the lustful intent within your heart.
Right. You know, I mentioned when I invited you on tonight, I said I want you to be blunt. And in talking about kissing, for example.
Yes.
Oh, now I get to put on my dad hat. Here it comes. Cover your ears, Andrew. When you're kissing your wife,
yes,
your hands are somewhere.
Yes.
Your hips are somewhere.
Yes.
You're usually not standing across the room.
No.
So just call it what it is.
Right.
That folks better be real careful. There's a reason that Paul told Timothy, flee youthful lusts. There's a reason that idea is given. To look in Proverbs 7 and to just go through that verse, and you know, as Solomon's speaking, and he says, "At the window of my house I looked through my lattice, I saw the simple. I saw among the simple, I perceived among the youths a young man devoid of understanding." So even though we're going to get to the point where all the men were strong men, here is someone who they're simple. They don't think it can happen. And it happens. He took the path to her house. And that's within the scripture. And it's like, what are you doing there? What are you doing there?
Yeah.
I know when I grew up in Crawfordsville, there was a place down by Sugar Creek. And it's where you went on Friday night. You got no business going there.
No.
There are some places you have no business being. Verse 9, in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night. Usually these things, and I know any more of these things are happening in broad daylight. I get that. But as much as what's happening in broad daylight, it's even worse in the middle of the night.
Right.
And it's like, you have no business being out at certain times, frankly. Unless you're working the graveyard shift, you got no business being out at 2 a.m.
Right.
And when my kids start dating, you can bet your bottom dollar you're going to have a curfew, and it ain't going to be 2 a.m. Okay?
Right.
You need to be home at a reasonable hour. There a woman met him with the attire of a harlot and a crafty heart. She was loud. She was rebellious. This is her nature. This is how this person is. That idea of rebellion. That idea, and I think this goes to like kind of what we've been talking about all along about a mindset. And is the person spiritually minded, or are they actually, do they have a rebellious heart? And it happens. Here in the passage, here in Proverbs chapter 7, over in verse 14, when she tells the fella, I have peace offerings with me, today I have paid my vows. Basically her way of saying, I'm actually a good girl. Right. And she actually smatters a little bit of a religion into it. It's like, I'm a good Christian girl. And boys will say, I'm a good Christian boy. And it's, you can put lipstick on a pig.
It's still a pig.
It's still a pig. You can dress up sexual immorality all you want to.
Right.
And you can deny it. We've had people who held presidents of the United States
Yes.
who tried to say it was something that it,
Right.
and it's like, no, you just call it what it is. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is. We've already mentioned the person in Proverbs 7. She says, oh, my husband's away on a trip. It's like, we won't get caught. You're caught already. You're caught already. The net's there.
Well, and you mentioned earlier that I'm the oldest here, so in case somebody thinks I'm just an old prude, I mentioned that Ashley and I got married later in life, and then I bring up kissing and how big a deal it is. Ashley and I had our first kiss after we were pronounced man and wife on our wedding night. So we have tried in our life together to model the same kind of behavior that we've expected from our children. So, I mean, we that's just the way that we tried to do and we considered it courtship as opposed to dating.
Right.
But you can call it what you want to. I mean, these are the principles that we tried to apply in our relationship, and that we've at least encouraged our children to apply as well, and kind of required them while they're home.
Yeah.
As much as we can do that.
And again, it's like, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. And it is a good thing to find a good wife, and all the lessons that come from that. It's just, you have to be careful. You have to be careful. There's actually, it's a quote by someone from the 1950s who I think was on her third or fourth husband, and she ended up leaving her husband. Husband was a ball player, and he was never home. And her quote was, if I'm going to be alone, I just assume be by myself. And I'm not saying she was remotely a Christian. That's not what I'm saying.
But
I'm saying the marriage was dysfunctional.
Yes.
God made marriage. And if we recognize how a godly marriage works, it will help us to better understand how dating, if you want to call it that, or courtship, or finding a spouse, how it's supposed to work. Andrew, you've been soaking it all in like a sponge.
Absolutely.
You have any comments or anything you want to add before we close out this week?
I mean, I guess to the point that Brace made, where there's not really, people can make determinations of where they're at with some of these things. Some of these, I guess, rule 1, rule 2, like you said, there's not really hard rules. There's principles that guide those things. I think it's a lot like the way we would talk about any other kind of temptation, in that, there's things that some people don't struggle with at all that other people do. The responsibility is really on each individual to know what is the thing that triggers that temptation for you. What is the thing that puts you in that situation? So it really takes a lot of honest self-reflection. And self-honesty is maybe one of the hardest kinds of honesty. Honesty is one of those things you hope to learn to do better in a relationship. But being honest with yourself is where people need to start when they're setting out on these kind of things. And I think I agree, like you said, having an idea of what those ground rules are beforehand is what's necessary.
Yeah, and it's just important. And sexual immorality, as much, and I think you're right, it's sort of like lust and what the Lord talked about. It begins in the heart. All these things begin in the heart. It just so happens this topic touches on something like nothing else. And I say that based on 1 Corinthians 6, when it's flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. So it all of a sudden it becomes a peculiar, but I know what you're saying, and I think you're right, that we have to look at these things like we look at a lot of things. Are we spiritually minded? Are we thinking about what God wants us to do? And now we're bringing someone else into the equation. And are we going to be able to follow the Lord together? And is that our goal? And I know, talking with you before, that's the real question. What's your goal? Mm-hmm. What are you looking for? He who finds a wife finds a good thing. But we're trying to make it to heaven. We're trying to follow the Lord. And we want to find someone to do that with us, who can help us, and we can help them, and raise a family and all those other things. And it's just nerve-wracking.
Yes.
But at the same time, it is an absolutely blessed thing and an exciting thing. When you meet that person and you start going down that road, and if you got it, and it's like, it's good. You have found a good thing. So appreciate Brace, Ashley. Go ahead.
Ashley and I have made this point to each other so many times. I mean, obviously, Scripture, as Andrew pointed out earlier, uses the marriage relationship as descriptive of our relationship with God. And we really feel like there are so many things about the nature of our relationship with God, oneness and heaven and all those things, that are best understood really in a good, godly marriage.
Right.
And so, it is a wonderful, wonderful blessing from God, and a great treat, and just a wonderful part of life that He's granted us here. So
you really don't understand. It's a reflection of Jesus and His church.
Yes.
You want to understand Jesus and His church? Look at marriage. You want to understand marriage? Look at Jesus and the church. Right. And it's just a wonderful thing. We've gone a few minutes over. I hope, hopefully that hasn't put you off or anything. I thought we've had thought it's been a good discussion about this topic. Brace, Ashley, thank you for being on with us this week.
Thank you for having us.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yep. Andrew, hope you have a good week. Take care of yourself.
Same to you all.
And appreciate everyone tuning in, and we hope you tune in next week. Thank you very much for having ears to hear.